Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight I want you to just settle in. Dim the lights, find your most comfortable spot, and let's just leave the noise of the modern world behind for a while. We're going to take a long, slow walk through the Valley of Mexico, back when the air was cool and the only sound was the soft splash of a paddle in the water. We're going to talk about the Aztecs, but not the wars or the sacrifices. Everyone talks about those. Tonight, we're focusing on something much more rhythmic and, honestly, much more impressive: the irrigation of the floating gardens. So, take a deep breath. Let's begin. The story of Tenochtitlan is usually told through the lens of conquest, but the real soul of the city was buried in the mud. Imagine, if you will, a group of people arriving at a swampy lake and being told by their gods that this soggy, mosquito-ridden marsh was home. Most people would have just kept walking, but the Aztecs decided to double down. Because why settle for dry land when you can invent your own? They created the Chinampas, or floating gardens, though floating is a bit of a misnomer. They weren't actually drifting around like rafts. They were meticulously anchored masterpieces of agricultural engineering. To build a Chinampa, you first had to be comfortable with a lot of mud. The farmers would stake out a long, narrow rectangle in the shallow lake bed using wattle fences made of willow branches. These willows were important. They weren't just for decoration. The farmers planted ahujo trees, water willows, along the edges because their roots grew straight down, anchoring the garden into the lake bed so your tomato plants didn't end up in the neighbor's yard after a heavy rain. Once the perimeter was set, they filled the middle with layers of aquatic vegetation, silt, and more mud. It was a repetitive, slow process of layering organic matter until the bed rose above the water level. The genius of this wasn't just in the land building, but in the hydration. The Aztecs didn't have to worry about droughts the way we do, because their gardens were literally sitting in the water. But you can't just let a plant sit in a swamp. The roots need to breathe. So, they designed a complex system of canals that acted like the circulatory system of the city. These canals were the highways, the irrigation lines, and the waste management system all rolled into one. The water level was controlled by a series of dikes and sluice gates, because, of course, the Aztecs were obsessed with order. They had to be. When you're living on a lake, a few inches of extra rain isn't just a puddle, it's a structural crisis. Let's float a bit deeper into the technicalities of the water. The Valley of Mexico was an endorheic basin, which is just a fancy way of saying the water goes in but it doesn't go out. This created a bit of a salty problem. Lake Texcoco was saline, which is great for salt production but terrible for corn. To fix this, the Aztecs built the Great Dike of Nezahualcóyotl. It was about 10 miles long and made of stone and wood. Its sole purpose was to keep the salty water of the eastern lake away from the fresh water of the western Chinampas. It was a massive, quiet wall that allowed the gardens to thrive. The irrigation itself was incredibly passive-aggressive in its efficiency. The soil in the Chinampas was porous enough that the lake water would seep through the willow-fenced walls, naturally wicking up into the root zones of the crops. This meant the plants had a constant, steady supply of moisture. No one had to stand there with a watering can for hours. However, the farmers did use long-handled scoops to throw nutrient-rich muck from the bottom of the canals onto the top of the beds. This was the ultimate recycling program. Every bit of organic waste, including human waste from the city, was processed and returned to the soil. It sounds a bit gross to our modern ears, but it was incredibly effective. It kept the soil so fertile that they could harvest up to 7 crops a year. Compare that to a European farmer at the time, who was lucky to get 1 or 2 harvests before the soil gave up and died of exhaustion. Imagine the rhythm of a day on the canals. A farmer wakes up as the mist is still clinging to the water. He steps into a narrow dugout canoe, called a calai. The water is glasscomb. He paddles slowly through the grid-like canals, the willow trees casting long, soft shadows. There's no rush here. The plants are growing at their own pace, fed by the slow filtration of the lake. He might stop to clear some lilies from a side channel or check the height of the water against a stone marker. It was a life dictated by the subtle rise and fall of the basin's water table. As the city grew, the irrigation system had to become even more precise. They weren't just growing food, they were managing an entire ecosystem. The canals had to be dredged constantly. If the silt built up too much, the water flow would stop, the oxygen levels would drop, and the whole system would turn into a stagnant mess. So, there was a perpetual, quiet labor force dedicated to moving mud. It was the most important job in the empire, yet it's rarely mentioned in the Chronicles of Kings. Without the mud movers, the kings wouldn't have had anything to eat. The complexity of the water management extended to the very houses of the people. Most homes in the Chinampa zones had their own small docks. You didn't walk to your neighbor's house, you rowed. This meant the entire urban layout was dictated by the needs of the water. Every street was a canal, and every canal was a source of life. The soundscape of Tenochtitlan wasn't the clatter of hooves on stone, since they didn't have horses, but the soft, repetitive dish of wooden paddles and the occasional splash of a water bird. Let's drift further down the canal, toward the edge of the freshwater zone. Here, the irrigation became a game of balance. If the spring rains were too heavy, the fresh water would overflow the dikes and the city would flood. If the rains were too light, the salt water from the east would creep back in. It was a constant, delicate dance with the environment. The Aztec engineers were masters of this. They understood the weight of water, the way it pressured the dikes, and the way it moved through the soil. They didn't have computers or steel, but they built a city of 200,000 people in the middle of a lake and kept everyone fed. The beauty of the Chinampa system was its resilience. It was a living machine. The willows provided shade, which reduced evaporation. The water provided a thermal mass, which protected the plants from the occasional highland frost. The fish in the canals provided a source of protein, and their waste further fertilized the water. It was a closed loop, a perfect circle of growth and decay, all managed by the gentle movement of water through the mud. As the sun sets over our imaginary valley, the canals turn a deep, reflective purple. The farmers are heading home, their canoes laden with flowers and vegetables. The irrigation system continues its work in the dark, the water silently seeping through the willow roots, keeping the heart of the empire beating. It's a slow, steady pulse, one that has lasted for centuries, even as the city above it changed beyond recognition. Chapter 2: The Floral Obsessions of the Fragile Elite. The transition from the muddy, practical labor of the Chinampa farmers to the manicured pleasure gardens of the Aztec nobility was a sharp one, though both relied on the same rhythmic flow of water. While the commoners were busy moving silt to ensure the city didn't starve, the elites were preoccupied with something much more ethereal, the perfect scent of a rare orchid. The Aztec emperors, particularly Moctezuma II, were obsessive botanists. They didn't just want gardens for food, they wanted living museums of the exotic. They sent expeditions hundreds of miles into the lowlands to bring back tropical plants, which were then transplanted into the cool, thin air of the Valley of Mexico. Of course, most of these plants should have died immediately, but the Aztecs doubled down on their engineering. They built specialized microclimates, using the thermal mass of the lake and heated stone walls to keep their pet flowers from shivering to death in the highland nights. Moctezuma's gardens at Huaxtepec were legendary, though legendary, in royal terms often just means expensive and slightly unnecessary. He had thousands of workers whose entire existence was dedicated to ensuring the water in the royal fountains flowed at a specific, pleasing volume. It wasn't enough to have water, it had to sound right. They designed stone channels with specific curves to create a melodic gurgle, a white noise machine for a ruler who was perpetually stressed about omens. The irony, of course, is that while he was listening to the soothing sounds of his custom-built brooks, the actual world was closing in on him. He spent his days wandering through groves of cacao and vanilla, perhaps trying to ignore the fact that his empire was a fragile ecosystem held together by mud and extreme taxation. The royal children, the princes and princesses of the Triple Alliance, lived lives that were simultaneously pampered and incredibly rigid. They were the precious stones and quetzal feathers of the palace, but they were also essentially ornamental. From a young age, they were taught to speak in a very specific, high-register version of Nahuatl that involved a lot of flowery metaphors and very little direct communication. If a prince wanted a drink of water, he wouldn't just ask for it. He'd likely have to reference the nectar of the clouds, or some other exhausting poetic imagery. These children were raised in the shadow of the great Chinampas, but they weren't allowed to get their hands dirty. They were kept in secluded courtyards where the irrigation was hidden behind carved stone, making the water seem like a magical gift rather than a result of backbreaking labor. There was a certain sadness to these royal nurseries. The mortality rate, even for the elite, was a hovering shadow. Despite their access to the best herbalists and the cleanest spring water piped in from Chapultepec, many royal children were described as delicate or sickly. They were often kept in a state of perpetual cooling, as the Aztecs believed heat was a source of illness. This meant they were constantly being fanned and bathed in lukewarm infusions of flowers, which probably just made them prone to catching chills. They were like the hothouse orchids their fathers collected, beautiful, expensive, and structurally incapable of surviving a stiff breeze. Let's float over to the specific botanical neuroses of the nobility. They had a particular fondness for the Sempasakil, the marigold, which they believed guided the souls of the dead. But they also loved the tigrita, or tiger flower, which blooms for only a single day. There's something very Aztec elite about dedicating an entire irrigated terrace to a flower that disappears in 24 hours. It was a display of ultimate waste, a way of saying, I have so much water and so much labor that I can spend it on a momentary whim. They also cultivated the handflower tree, whose blossoms look like tiny, red, clawed hands. It was rare, difficult to grow, and slightly creepy. Naturally, it was a royal favorite. The irrigation for these pleasure gardens was separate from the agricultural canals. The emperors didn't want to wash their hands in the same water used to fertilize the corn. They commissioned massive stone aqueducts to bring virgin water from the springs of Chapultepec across the lake and into the city. When the first aqueduct was built, it was considered a marvel, but as the city grew, the demand for pure water became a logistical nightmare. Nezahualcóyotl, the poet king of Texcoco, was the mastermind behind much of this. He was the kind of ruler who would write a poem about the fleeting nature of life and then immediately go out and design a dam that would last 500 years. He was a man of contrasts, a philosopher who understood that philosophy is much easier to practice when you have a reliable plumbing system. The tragic end of these gardens is, like most things in royal history, a bit of a slow-motion disaster. When the Spanish finally arrived and saw the gardens of Iztapalapa, they were genuinely stunned. They wrote that they had never seen anything so beautiful in Europe. And then, in a very characteristic move, they destroyed them. They filled in the canals to make roads for their horses, and they cut down the exotic groves because they didn't understand the irrigation. The half-baked potato monarchs of Europe, as we might call some of the later Habsburgs who eventually inherited the ruins, had no idea how to maintain a city that breathed through water. They turned a floating paradise back into a dusty basin, proving that it's much easier to break a complex system than it is to understand the rhythm of its flow. But tonight, we aren't there yet. The Spanish are still a distant rumor. In our world, the water is still flowing through the stone pipes. The handflower blossoms are just beginning to open in the royal courtyard. A young prince, dressed in a cape of hummingbird feathers, is sitting by a small, melodic fountain, watching the ripples move in perfect, concentric circles. He doesn't know about the future. He only knows the cool mist of the fountain and the steady, rhythmic splash of the gardeners moving through the distant canals. Chapter 3: The Fragile Pedigree of the Sun-Drenched Habsburgs. The transition from the fluid, aqueous engineering of the Aztecs to the rigid, bone-dry etiquette of the Spanish court was a bit like jumping from a refreshing spring into a pile of dusty velvet. When the Spanish eventually took the reins of the Valley of Mexico, they brought with them a very specific kind of chaos, the Habsburg family tree. If the Aztec gardens were a masterpiece of diversification and sustainable flow, the Habsburg lineage was the exact opposite. It was a closed loop that eventually grew so tight it started to choke itself. We're moving from the meticulously managed mud of the Chinampas to the meticulously managed bloodlines of the most powerful and genetically confused family in Europe. At the center of this was the idea of sangre azul, or blue blood. The Spanish elite were obsessed with the purity of their ancestry, which is ironic considering they were essentially building a biological cul-de-sac. They didn't want new blood, they wanted the same blood, just recycled until it became a bit thin. This brings us to the quintessential Habsburg look. You know the one. The heavy, drooping lower lip, the prominent chin that seemed to be trying to escape the face, and a general expression of mild, permanent confusion. They called it the Habsburg jaw, but really, it was just the physical manifestation of a family that refused to swipe left on their own cousins. Take, for instance, the marriage alliances that governed the world the Aztecs had once known. While the farmers in Mexico were grafting willow branches to anchor their soil, the Spanish royals were grafting family branches that had no business being near each other. Philip II of Spain, the man who oversaw the vast expansion of the empire into the Americas, was a workaholic with a penchant for black clothing and extremely stressful marriages. He was, in many ways, the human equivalent of a very slow, very bureaucratic glacier. He spent his life sitting in a cold stone palace called El Escorial, which looked more like a monastery than a royal residence, obsessing over paperwork and the state of his soul. Philip's marital history was a revolving door of strategic and often tragic disasters. His first wife was his double first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal. Because why look outside the family when you can just marry someone who shares half your DNA? They had a son, Don Carlos, who would go on to become the poster child for royal dysfunction. Carlos was, to put it gently, a bit of a mess. He was physically frail, mentally unstable, and had a habit of biting the heads off small birds. He was the biological bill coming due for generations of pure blood. He was so difficult to manage that his father eventually had him imprisoned in his own rooms, where he died after trying to go on a hunger strike that involved eating a diamond-encrusted ring. It was a far cry from the rhythmic, purposeful life of the Aztec canal movers. Then there was Philip's second wife, Mary I of England, Bloody Mary, to her enemies, but just a very lonely, very disappointed woman to her husband. Philip didn't particularly like England. He found the weather damp and the people rude. He spent most of the marriage trying to find excuses to be literally anywhere else. When Mary had a phantom pregnancy, believing she was carrying the heir to both empires, Philip was already mentally halfway back to Spain. The marriage was a cold, sterile affair that produced nothing but a lot of awkward letters and a bit of a diplomatic headache. By the time we get to the later Habsburgs, the genetic situation had moved from unfortunate to statistically improbable. We have to talk about Charles II of Spain, the final boss of inbreeding. He was known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because people literally could not believe that nature had produced him without the help of a dark curse. He didn't speak until he was 4, didn't walk until he was 8, and his jaw was so oversized that he couldn't chew his food properly. He was the ruler of a global empire that stretched from the Philippines to the ruins of Tenochtitlan, yet he was a man who needed help getting dressed and spent his time playing with toys in the palace. The irony here is almost too heavy to handle. Here was an empire that had conquered the sophisticated, water-wise Aztecs, claiming a sort of divine superiority, yet it was being led by men who were biologically unraveling. The Aztecs had managed a complex lake system with the precision of a watchmaker. The Habsburgs were struggling to manage their own facial features. While the Spanish were busy draining the lakes of Mexico, because they didn't like the messiness of the water, their own royal line was drying up from a lack of genetic diversity. They replaced the lush, green Chinampas with dusty, European-style plazas, and they replaced a functioning ecosystem with a stagnant bureaucracy. The Spanish court was a place of extreme, slow-motion ritual. There were rules for everything. How many steps you could take toward the king, how long a sleeve should be, who was allowed to sit on a certain stool. It was a system designed to prevent change, much like the marriages were designed to keep power in the family. But change is the one thing you can't stop, whether it's the silt building up in a canal or the mutations building up in a genome. The Habsburgs tried to freeze time, sitting in their dark palaces surrounded by portraits of their increasingly chin-heavy ancestors, while the world they claimed to own continued to spin, and the gardens they had conquered slowly turned to dust. Chapter 4. The Silent Choreography of the Palace Shadows. Life in the Spanish royal court wasn't just a burden for the monarchs with the oversized jaws. It was a grueling, slow-motion marathon for the thousands of servants who kept the gears of the empire turning. While the Aztec commoners had spent their days in the sun, moving mud and breathing the fresh air of the lake, the Spanish palace staff lived in a world of permanent twilight. The Escorial, and later the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, were stone labyrinths where the sun rarely reached the inner corridors. To be a servant to a Habsburg was to enter a life of quietude, which is just a fancy way of saying you had to be invisible until you were needed to hold a silver basin or adjust a heavy, velvet curtain. The hierarchy of the palace was so complex it made the Aztec canal system look like a backyard puddle. There was a specific official for everything. You had the sumiller de corps, who was essentially the king's most glorified valet, and the mayordomo mayor, who ran the household with the iron fist of a man who took linen counts very seriously. Because the Habsburgs believed their bodies were semi-divine, the act of getting them dressed was a religious ceremony. It could take hours. Imagine standing perfectly still in a drafty stone room, holding a pair of silk stockings, waiting for a monarch who is currently staring at a wall to decide if he wants to move his left foot. It was a life of extreme patience and, I suspect, a great deal of internal eye-rolling. The laundry alone was a logistical nightmare. The Spanish elite had a thing for galillas, those stiff, white collars that made everyone look like their head was being served on a dinner plate. These collars had to be perfectly starched and pristine. There were servants whose entire existence was dedicated to the maintenance of the neck ruff. If there was a single smudge of ink or a stray drop of chocolate, it was a minor diplomatic incident. This was the irony of the Spanish conquest. They had destroyed the Aztecs' sophisticated waste management canals, yet they lived in palaces that often smelled of stale perfume and unwashed wool, because while they were obsessed with white collars, they weren't particularly fond of full-body baths. They believed water opened the pores to disease, a sharp contrast to the Aztecs, who bathed daily in the lake and used steam baths for health. Inside the nursery, the meninas, or ladies-in-waiting, had the most delicate job of all. They had to entertain the royal children, who were often so fragile they weren't allowed to play like normal humans. These children were encased in miniature versions of adult clothing, stiff corsets and heavy skirts, that made them look like little dolls. The meninas would spend hours kneeling on the floor, offering water in tiny clay jars or reading stories in hushed tones. They were the ones who saw the half-baked potatoes in their most vulnerable moments, watching as the young princes struggled to breathe or walk under the weight of their own pedigree. It was a world of whispers and soft footsteps on cold tiles. Then there were the court jesters and the people of pleasure, as they were strangely called. These were often individuals with physical disabilities or dwarfism, brought to court to act as living contrasts to the perfection of the royal line. It was a cruel sort of irony. The Habsburgs, who were themselves becoming increasingly physically distinct due to inbreeding, kept these individuals around to feel more normal. Yet, in the famous paintings of the era, like Velázquez's Las Meninas, these court figures often look like the most soulful, intelligent people in the room. They were the observers, the ones who saw the absurdity of a king who couldn't chew his own food but claimed to own half the world. The kitchen staff lived in a different kind of hell. The Spanish kings were notoriously picky, yet their meals were served with a level of ceremony that ensured the food was stone cold by the time it reached the royal mouth. A dish would be prepared, placed on a silver tray, passed from a cook to a page, from a page to a nobleman, and finally to the king's table, with everyone bowing along the way. By the time the king poked at his partridge, the grease had already congealed. It was a performance of power where the actual result, a hot meal, was secondary to the ritual of the delivery. It was the ultimate because why not double down moment of the Spanish court. Let's float toward the lower levels where the water carriers and wood haulers worked. In a city like Madrid, which was increasingly dry and dusty after the lushness of the colonial imagination, water was a precious commodity. Unlike the Aztecs, who had piped fresh spring water directly into their city via aqueducts, the Spanish palace relied on a grueling human chain. Water was hauled up from deep wells or brought in on carts, then carried in heavy jars to the various levels of the palace. It was a constant, rhythmic struggle against gravity. The silence of the upper floors was only possible because of the sweating, straining labor in the basements. There was a specific kind of melancholy to being a palace servant in the twilight of the Habsburg era. You were watching a house collapse in slow motion. You were polishing the silver for a family that was slowly losing its grip on reality. As Charles II's health declined, the palace became a tomb-like space, filled with priests and physicians who were all trying to cure a genetic dead end with prayers and questionable ointments. The servants watched as the bewitched king wandered the halls, talking to the portraits of his ancestors, perhaps asking them why they had left him with such a heavy chin and such a light soul. Chapter 5. The Bitter Froth of Colonial Cravings. It's a bit funny, isn't it, how the thing that finally bridged the gap between the muddy canals of Tenochtitlan and the stiff, airless rooms of the Spanish court was a drink that looked like sludge and tasted like a dark, earthy secret. We're talking about chocolate, but not the sweet, milky bars you'd find at a checkout counter today. This was Zacatl, a drink that the Aztecs considered so potent it was practically a pharmaceutical. When the Spanish first encountered it, they weren't quite sure what to do with it. It was bitter, it was spicy, and it had a layer of foam on top that looked, frankly, a bit suspicious. But of course, once they realized it was a stimulant, the Spanish elite decided to double down on it, because if there was one thing a Habsburg needed, it was a way to stay awake through 4-hour prayer sessions. In the Aztec world, cacao beans were literally money. You could buy a turkey for 100 beans or a high-quality cotton cloak for 60. Imagine walking into a store today and paying with a handful of almonds. It was a currency that grew on trees, provided you lived in the hot, humid lowlands. The irrigation systems we talked about earlier were vital for these trees, which were notoriously finicky. They liked wet feet but a dry head, meaning they needed constant water at the roots but hated direct, scorching sun. The Aztec farmers would plant taller, mother-of-cacao trees to provide shade, creating a rhythmic, layered canopy that kept the precious beans happy. When the beans finally reached the royal palaces, the preparation was a slow, meditative process. The beans were roasted, ground into a paste on a stone metate, and then mixed with water, chili peppers, and vanilla. But the most important part, the part that separates the commoners from the precious stones of the elite, was the foam. To get the foam just right, you had to pour the liquid from one vessel to another from a great height, over and over, until it developed a thick, velvety head. It was a rhythmic, splashing sound that echoed through the stone courtyards. For the Aztecs, the foam was the soul of the drink. To drink it flat was to miss the point entirely. The Spanish, however, had a bit of a problem with the chili peppers. Their European palates, raised on bland porridges and roasted meats, found the heat a bit much. So they did what they always did. They added sugar. They also swapped the chili for cinnamon and started serving it hot instead of cold. This transformed the drink from a bracing warrior's tonic into a thick, syrupy indulgence that took the Spanish court by storm. By the time it reached the ladies-in-waiting in Madrid, chocolate had become a full-blown obsession. It was the only thing allowed to be consumed during long church fasts, because the church ruled that liquid does not break a fast. It was a classic royal loophole, and the Habsburgs jumped through it with enthusiasm. In the Spanish palaces, the preparation became even more elaborate. They invented the molinillo, a carved wooden whisk that you would spin between your palms to create that essential foam without having to pour the drink all over the floor. The sound of the molinillo, a soft, wooden whirring, became the background noise of the aristocratic afternoon. It was served in jicaras, specialized gourds or porcelain cups, often sitting in a silver stand called a mansarina to prevent spills. Because heaven forbid a Habsburg drop a single drop of chocolate on their starched white collar. The half-baked potatoes of the later Habsburg line were particularly fond of this ritual. For someone like Charles II, whose jaw made chewing solid food a struggle, a high-calorie, liquid diet was actually a practical necessity. He would sit in his darkened rooms, surrounded by his silent servants, sipping on this sweet, dark infusion of a conquered world. There is a deep, quiet irony in the fact that the very thing that sustained the last of the Spanish Habsburgs was a product of the civilization they had worked so hard to erase. The chocolate was a ghost of the Chinampas, haunting the palaces of the men who had drained the lakes. But the obsession went beyond taste. It became medicinal. The court physicians, who were usually busy applying leeches to the royal family, decided that chocolate was a tempering agent. They believed it could balance the humors, cooling the blood or warming the stomach, depending on what the king's latest ailment was. It was prescribed for everything from melancholy to digestion. If a prince was feeling particularly sickly and spoiled, the answer was almost always another cup of chocolate. It was the original comfort food, a warm, sugary blanket for a dynasty that was slowly freezing to death in its own etiquette. As the sun sets on the 17th century, the smell of roasted cacao lingers in the corridors of the Alcazar. The Malinillos are silent for the night. Somewhere in the vastness of the former Aztec Empire, a farmer is still tending to a cacao grove, the water from a small canal trickling toward the roots of a tree. The empire of the Habsburgs is crumbling, its gold spent, its bloodline thinning, but the chocolate remains. It's a slow, rhythmic constant, a bittersweet reminder that while empires fall and canals fill with silt, some habits are far too delicious to die. Chapter 6: The Kingdom of the Kids and the Nursery Politics of Decay. The Spanish royal nursery was a place where the weight of a global empire rested on the very narrow, very fragile shoulders of children who often looked like they were made of parchment. We've moved from the dark, liquid luxury of the chocolate service into the brightly lit, yet strangely stifling world of the infantes. In the Habsburg world, childhood wasn't a time for running or playing, it was a high-stakes waiting room. Because the mortality rate was so high, thanks to a combination of genetic overlap and a medical community that thought more leeches was the answer to everything. The birth of a royal child was treated like a miracle that everyone expected to break at any moment. These children were the kingdom of the kids, a subterranean political layer of the palace where the ladies-in-waiting and the royal wet nurses held more actual power than the ministers of state. If a prince wouldn't eat his porridge, it wasn't just a toddler tantrum, it was a national security crisis. The nursery was a world of soft power, governed by the rhythm of rocking cradles and the hushed tones of women trying to keep a sickly air from catching a draft. Of course, the Habsburgs doubled down on the protection, which usually meant the children were never allowed outside and were wrapped in so many layers of silk and wool that they probably suffered from heat stroke in the middle of winter. Let's look at the half-baked potatoes in their infancy. Because of the Habsburg jaw and other assorted genetic quirks, many of these babies had trouble nursing. This led to a desperate, constant rotation of wet nurses, who were brought in from the mountains of Asturias because the court believed peasant blood from the highlands was the sturdiest. Imagine being a healthy village woman suddenly whisked away to a palace where you are expected to provide life force to a baby who looks more like a wilted lily than a future king. These nurses were the only ones who actually touched the royal children with any warmth, yet they were treated like biological faucets, discarded once the child was weaned, if the child lived that long. The politics of the nursery were incredibly petty. Every lady-in-waiting was vying for the favor of a child who was barely old enough to hold a rattle. They would whisper in the ears of the toddlers, planting seeds of loyalty that would, hopefully, blossom into a lucrative position 20 years down the line. It was a slow-motion chess game played with wooden blocks. While the Aztec princes were raised in communal settings where they were taught the arts of war and poetry, the Habsburg children were raised in isolation, surrounded by adults who were essentially using them as human lottery tickets. There was also the weird, dark habit of protective talismans. Because the royals were so terrified of the evil eye or sudden fevers, the royal children were often draped in so many amulets they rattled when they moved. They wore necklaces of coral to protect the blood, paws of badgers to ward off spirits, and dried pieces of saints' bones stitched into their waistcoats. It was a bizarre blend of Catholic piety and folk superstition. You had a child who was theoretically the heir to the most Catholic monarchy in the world, yet they were walking around looking like a tiny, gilded version of a shaman. The irony of this kingdom of the kids was that the more they were protected, the weaker they seemed to become. They were never allowed to develop an immune system because they were kept in sterilized, airless rooms. They were never allowed to develop muscles because they were carried everywhere until they were far too old for it. By the time a prince like Balthasar Charles or the ill-fated Philip Prospero reached the age of 5, they often had the physical stamina of an 80-year-old. Philip Prospero was so fragile that he was famously painted with a pet dog that looked significantly more robust and alert than he did. The dogs seemed to be the only thing in the room that wasn't worried about the future. When a royal child did inevitably pass away, which happened with a heartbreaking rhythmic regularity, the palace didn't just mourn, it performed. The little funerals were elaborate, expensive affairs where the child was dressed in the robes of a monk or a nun and displayed on a bed of flowers. It was a return to that floral obsession we saw with the Aztecs, but with a much more morbid twist. The child became a decorative object in death, just as they had been in life. The parents would then retreat to their oratories to pray for another heir, and the whole cycle of inbred desperation would start all over again. As we float through the quiet, empty nurseries of the Alcazar, we can almost hear the ghostly rattle of those coral amulets. It was a world of immense wealth and zero vitality. The Habsburgs had all the gold of the Americas and all the chocolate of the Aztecs, but they couldn't buy a healthy heartbeat for their children. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, a kingdom of shadows where the only thing that grew reliably was the family tree, looping back on itself until there was nowhere left for the sap to flow. Chapter 7. The Holy Mud and the Mineral Melancholy. We've reached a point in our journey where the line between medicine, superstition, and a desperate craving for something, anything, to break the monotony of palace life begins to blur. We are moving from the nursery into the boudoirs of the Spanish queens and princesses. These were women who lived in a state of perpetual, elegant boredom, trapped by a court etiquette so rigid it was practically a physical weight. And when the mind is that bored and the body is that restricted, the soul starts to crave strange things. This brings us to one of the most bizarre fads of the Habsburg era, bucophagia, or the practice of eating clay. It sounds like a joke, or perhaps a sign of a very specific nutritional deficiency, which, to be fair, it probably was. But for the elite women of the 17th century, eating small, red ceramic jars called buqueros was the height of sophistication. These weren't just any jars. They were crafted from special porous clay, often imported from Portugal or the New Spain they had recently conquered. They were designed to hold water, which they would cool through evaporation, a bit like a miniature version of the cooling lake breezes of Tenochtitlan. But the ladies of the court decided that the water wasn't enough. They wanted the vessel itself. The process was rhythmic and slow. A princess would sit on her velvet cushion, take a small shard of a broken buquero, and slowly nibble on it throughout the afternoon. Well, because why not double down on a digestive disaster if it makes you look fashionably pale? The clay was believed to have medicinal properties, specifically to cure melancholy and to act as a form of birth control, mostly by making the woman so physically ill that her body simply shut down. But the most desired side effect was the opaline complexion. The clay caused a form of chlorosis or green sickness, a type of anemia that made the skin look ghostly white, almost translucent. In a world where tan skin meant you were a peasant working in the sun, looking like a sickly, moonlit ghost was the ultimate status symbol. The irony here is thick enough to choke on. While the Aztec commoners were thriving on a diet of nutrient-dense spirulina from the lake and fresh corn from the Chinampas, the most powerful women in the world were literally eating dirt to make themselves look like they were dying. It was a slow-motion biological sabotage. The clay would obstruct the intestines and swell the liver. Physicians of the time, who, as we've established, were mostly guessing, would see these women turning a faint shade of green and prescribe more clay, mixed with iron filings or, if they were feeling particularly festive, ground-up pearls. Let's float over to the sensory experience of this habit. The buqueros were often scented. The clay was mixed with ambergris, musk, or flower petals before being fired at low temperatures. When moistened with water or saliva, the jars released a deep, earthy perfume that reminded many of the first rain hitting dry soil. For these women, locked inside stone walls and heavy tapestries, that smell was a tiny, forbidden window into the natural world. Eating the clay was a way to literally consume the earth they were never allowed to walk upon freely. It was a tragic, dusty kind of intimacy with a world they only saw through carriage windows. The church, of course, had thoughts. Some priests viewed bucophagia as a form of gluttony or even a slow-form suicide, while others were more lenient, seeing it as a harmless female eccentricity. But the habit was so pervasive that it appears in the great art of the time. In Velázquez's Los Meninas, you can see the young Infanta Margarita being offered a small red bucero on a silver tray by a lady-in-waiting. It's presented with the same reverence as a holy relic. The child is being initiated into a lifetime of mineral-based melancholy, one bite of scented mud at a time. There is a rhythmic sadness to the life of a Habsburg queen. Her primary job was to produce an heir, yet she was encouraged to engage in a habit that made her too sickly to carry one. She was surrounded by the gold of the Americas, yet she craved the taste of cheap clay. She was the center of a global empire, yet her world was reduced to the size of a ceramic jar. As the dynasty progressed, the half-baked potatoes and their porcelain-skinned wives became increasingly disconnected from the reality of the land they ruled. They were living in a mineral dream, their stomachs full of dust and their heads full of incense. As the evening mist settles over the Escorial, we can imagine the sound of a small ceramic jar shattering on a stone floor. The shards are gathered up, not to be thrown away, but to be tucked into silk pockets for later. The water in the remaining jars stays cool and still, reflecting the flickering candlelight. Outside, the world is moving toward the Enlightenment, toward science and change, but inside the palace, the rhythm remains the same. A soft, dry crunch, a long sigh, and the slow, steady accumulation of red clay in the heart of a dying empire. Chapter 8. The Frozen Kings and the Architecture of Artificial Winter. The Spanish Habsburgs had a very complicated relationship with heat. In the scorching summers of the Castilian plateau, where the sun beats down on the stone palaces until they radiate warmth like an oven, the half-baked potatoes grew desperate for the one thing they couldn't simply decree into existence: cold. While the Aztecs had relied on the natural cooling of the lake breezes and the shade of the willow-fringed Chinampas, the Spanish royals decided to engineer an artificial winter. This led to the creation of the Pozas de Nieve, or snow wells, massive, subterranean stone pits where the winter's ice was stored to be consumed during the sweltering months of July and August. Because when you're a king of the sun-drenched empire, why not double down and demand ice in the desert? The logistics of this were, predictably, a slow-motion nightmare for everyone involved. During the winter months, teams of laborers would climb into the Sierra Guadarrama mountains to harvest snow. They would pack it into these deep, stone-lined pits, layering it with straw and salt to keep it from melting into a puddle. It was a rhythmic, back-breaking process of tamping down the white powder until it turned into a solid, glassy block. This ice would then be hauled down the mountainside on the backs of mules in the dead of night, wrapped in heavy blankets to protect it from the morning sun. It was a race against physics, conducted at a snail's pace. In the palace, the arrival of the ice was treated with the same reverence as a diplomatic envoy. It was taken to the royal cellars, where it was used for one primary purpose: the cooling of the wine and the creation of sorbetes. The Habsburgs were obsessed with temperature control. They believed that drinking room temperature wine was a sign of low status, a habit of the dusty masses. A proper royal drink had to be chilled until the silver goblet frosted over. They even had specialized cooling pages, whose only job was to stand behind the king and slowly rotate a bottle of wine in a basin of crushed ice, ensuring a perfectly uniform chill. It was a quiet, circular motion that lasted for hours. The Frozen Kings also used ice for more than just their drinks. As the health of the dynasty declined, the physicians began to use ice as a desperate, final remedy for the chronic fevers that plagued the royal children. When the precious stones of the nursery grew too hot to the touch, they were placed on mattresses cooled by pans of ice. It was a tragic, shivering irony. These children, already so fragile and delicate, were being subjected to artificial winters in a desperate attempt to reset their internal thermostats. It was as if the court believed that if they could just keep the body cool enough, time itself would stop, and the inevitable decay of the bloodline would be frozen in place. There was a certain aesthetic to this obsession with the cold. The Habsburgs loved the look of frost. They favored silver over gold because it looked colder. They wore heavy, dark velvets that absorbed light, making the palace feel like a tomb even in the height of summer. They were trying to create a microclimate of stillness, a world where nothing moved, nothing sweated, and nothing changed. It was a stark contrast to the vibrant, humid energy of the Aztec markets they had replaced. The Habsburgs wanted a world of glass and stone, while the Aztecs had lived in a world of water and growth. The irony of the snow wells was that they were incredibly inefficient. For every 10 pounds of ice harvested in the mountains, only about 2 pounds actually made it into the king's wine. The rest simply evaporated or leaked away into the dry earth of Castile. It was a perfect metaphor for the empire itself, a massive, expensive effort that yielded a very small, very fleeting result. The Habsburgs were spending a fortune to keep their wine cold while their treasury was emptying and their territories were slipping away. They were masters of the peripheral detail, focusing on the temperature of a grape while the foundations of their house were cracking. As we drift into the deep, chilled shadows of the royal wine cellar, the air is thick with the smell of damp straw and old oak. The ice is melting, one slow, rhythmic drop at a time, echoing against the stone floor. It's a quiet, cold countdown. Outside, the sun is still blazing over the ruins of the Aztec canals, but down here, in the artificial winter of the Habsburgs, everything is frozen in a state of expensive, chilly stagnation. The king takes a sip of his frosted wine, his oversized jaw clicking against the silver rim, and for a moment, the heat of the world feels very far away. Chapter 9. The Perfumed Purgatory and the Olfactory Shield. The Habsburg court may have been obsessed with the chill of the mountains and the coolness of the clay, but there was one sensory reality they couldn't freeze or nibble away: the smell. We've reached the perfumed purgatory, a period where the Spanish elite lived in a constant, aromatic battle against their own biology. You see, the Aztecs had been almost fanatical about hygiene. They had public latrines, they used the fruit of the copal tree as soap, and Moctezuma himself bathed several times a day in the fresh waters of the lake. The Spanish, however, viewed water with a deep, theological suspicion. To them, a bath was a dangerous opening of the pores, a literal invitation for the plague to walk right in. And so, they decided to double down on the one thing that doesn't actually remove dirt: perfume. The palace of the Habsburgs was a place where the scent of unwashed wool, rotting wood, and the half-baked potato anatomy was masked by layers of ambergris, musk, and civet. It wasn't just a light spritz, it was an olfactory assault. They used perfume burners in every room, braziers filled with aromatic woods and resins that produced a thick, rhythmic smoke. It was supposed to purify the air, but in reality, it just created a dense, hazy purgatory where you couldn't see the person across the table, though you could certainly smell the jasmine-scented sweat radiating off them. The royal garments were the primary carriers of this aromatic shield. Because these heavy velvets and stiff brocades were almost impossible to wash without ruining them, they were instead aired out, and then stuffed with sachets of dried lavender and cloves. The clothing became a sort of walking potpourri. When a nobleman moved, he didn't just rustle, he released a cloud of spices that had been trapped in his sleeves since the previous winter. This was considered the height of elegance. If you smelled strongly enough of expensive musk, it proved you didn't have to engage in this sweaty labor of the commoners who were out there dredging the canals. There was a particular obsession with scented gloves. The Spanish were world-renowned for their leather, but leather has a naturally pungent, animalistic odor. To fix this, they soaked the skins in floral oils for months. These amber gloves were so prized that they were often given as diplomatic gifts. Imagine a royal meeting where everyone is wearing gloves that smell like a concentrated garden of lilies, trying to ignore the fact that the room hasn't seen a fresh breeze in 3 weeks. It was a world of artificial sweetness layered over a very natural decay. The queens and princesses, those porcelain ghosts we talked about earlier, took it even further. They used pastilles, small, scented lozenges that they would tuck into their cheeks to ensure their breath was as floral as their clothes. It was a 24-hour commitment to being a human flower. But of course, the underlying irony remained. No amount of rosewater could replace the basic plumbing the Aztecs had mastered. While the Spanish were busy inventing new ways to scent their hair with powdered iris, the actual sewers of Madrid were, well, they weren't really sewers at all. They were just streets. Even the royal chocolate wasn't safe from the perfume craze. As the 17th century wore on, the Spanish started adding ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the digestive system of sperm whales, to their drinks. It was expensive, it was rare, and it tasted like a salty, floral version of the ocean. They believed it was an aphrodisiac, but mostly it just added another layer to the perfumed purgatory. A Habsburg king would sit in his smoky room, wearing his spicy gloves, sipping his whale-scented chocolate, and wonder why he felt so perpetually nauseous. This aromatic obsession was a form of denial. If they could control the smell of the palace, they could pretend they were in control of the empire. It was a way to distance themselves from the stench of the common people, the mud of the colonies, and the decay of their own family tree. But like the ice that melted in the cellars, the perfume eventually faded. Beneath the jasmine and the musk, the reality of the Habsburg condition remained. They were a family out of time, living in a fragrant bubble that was getting thinner by the day. As the incense smoke drifts lazily toward the high, vaulted ceilings of the Escorial, the rhythm of the palace slows down for the night. The perfume burners are extinguished, leaving behind a heavy, cloying scent that clings to the tapestries like a ghost. The half-baked potatoes sleep in their scented beds, dreaming of a world that is perfectly still and perfectly fragrant, while outside, the night air remains stubbornly, refreshingly indifferent to their royal desires. Chapter 10. The Clockwork Kings and the Stagnant Gears of Time. As the empire grew larger and the bloodline grew thinner, the Habsburgs developed a final, quiet obsession, the measurement of time. Specifically, they became the world's most dedicated collectors of clocks and automatons. It was a strange, rhythmic hobby for a family that seemed to be doing everything in its power to stop time from moving forward. While the Aztecs had viewed time as a great, repeating circle, a cosmic calendar that required the careful balance of water and sky, the Spanish kings viewed time as something that could be captured in a golden box and forced to tick in a corner of their study. Charles V, the grandfather of Philip II, was perhaps the first to succumb to the mechanical madness. After he abdicated his throne, exhausted by the sheer effort of trying to hold Europe together, he retired to the monastery of Yusti. He didn't spend his final days in prayer, as one might expect. Instead, he spent them surrounded by hundreds of clocks. He was obsessed with trying to get them all to tick in perfect unison. He would spend hours with a small screwdriver, adjusting a gear here or a spring there, only to realize that even a king cannot make two clocks agree on the exact second. It was a lesson in futility that he seemed to find strangely comforting. This obsession was passed down through the generations like a recessive gene. By the time we reached the later, more half-baked potato monarchs, the palace was filled with mechanical toys that performed little dramas at the turn of a key. There were golden birds that sang, tiny soldiers that marched in circles, and even mechanical monks that knelt and beat their chests in penance. These were the Clockwork Kings, men who felt more at home with brass gears than with their own ministers. They liked the predictability of a machine. A gear doesn't ask for a tax break, and a spring doesn't inherit a throne it can't handle. The irony of the Habsburg clock collection was that while their machines were becoming more precise, their empire was falling out of sync. While they were obsessing over the escapement of a Swiss timepiece, the actual timing of their treasure fleets from the Americas was becoming a chaotic mess. The gold that was supposed to fund their wars was constantly arriving late, or not at all, lost to pirates or storms. The kings would sit in their silent rooms, listening to the rhythmic tick-tock of 100 clocks, while the real world outside was moving at a speed they could no longer track. There was also something deeply melancholy about the timekeepers of the nursery. The sickly royal children were often given these intricate toys to keep them occupied, as they weren't allowed to do anything as vigorous as playing with a ball. A young prince might spend his entire afternoon watching a mechanical silver swan move its neck back and forth. It was a repetitive, hypnotic movement that mirrored the repetitive, stagnant nature of his own life. The toys were perfect, polished, and entirely dead, much like the court etiquette that governed their every breath. As Charles II, the last of the line, reached his final years, his obsession with time took a darker turn. He became convinced that the clocks were mocking him. He could hear them ticking through the walls, a constant reminder that the Habsburg era was winding down. He had no air, no strength, and a jaw that made even the simplest tasks a trial. The clocks were the only things in the palace that still had a steady pulse. In his final days, the rooms were filled with the sound of whirring gears and striking bells, a cacophony of artificial life that only served to highlight the silence of the dying dynasty. The Clockwork Kings eventually ran out of time, just as the Aztecs' great sunstone had predicted all things must. The gears finally ground to a halt, the springs snapped, and the empire was handed over to a new family, the Bourbons, who brought with them a different kind of chaos. But the clocks remained in the dusty halls of the Escorial, their golden faces reflecting the dim light, still ticking away for no one in particular. It was a rhythmic, mechanical epitaph for a family that had tried to master time, only to be consumed by it. As we leave the ticking galleries and drift back toward the cool, quiet waters of our beginning, the sound of the clocks fades into the soft splash of a paddle. The mechanical birds stop singing, and the real birds of the Mexican Valley take over. The empire of gears is gone, but the rhythm of the water remains, a slow, steady pulse that doesn't need a key to keep moving. Chapter 11. The last sigh of the lake and the hubris of dry land. We've reached the final, dusty stretch of our journey, moving away from the ticking clocks and the scented gloves into the mud. But this time, the mud isn't being used to grow life. It's being moved to kill a lake. We have to talk about the DSAG, the massive, centuries-long engineering project to drain the Valley of Mexico. To the Spanish, the water that had sustained the Aztecs was nothing but a nuisance. It was disorderly. It flooded their cathedrals and made their basements damp. And so, they decided to do the most European thing possible. They decided to fight the geography of a basin that had been a lake for 10,000 years. The project began in earnest in 1607, led by a man named Enrico Martinez. He wasn't a Habsburg, but he had that classic colonial confidence, the kind that makes you think you can outsmart a mountain range with a few thousand shovels. His plan was to dig a massive tunnel, the Tunnel of Huatoca, to drain the water out of the basin and into the Tula River. It was a rhythmic, soul-crushing labor. Thousands of indigenous workers, the descendants of those who had built the Chinampas, were forced to dig through the earth with hand tools. It was a dark, subterranean mirror to the sunny work of their ancestors. Instead of lifting mud to create land, they were digging holes to destroy a world. Of course, because this is history, things went wrong almost immediately. The tunnel was too small, the soil was too unstable, and the water, stubborn as it was, refused to go where it was told. During the Great Flood of 1629, Mexico City was submerged for 5 whole years. People lived on the second floors of their stone houses, rowing boats through streets that were once canals but were now just stagnant, sewage-filled traps. The Spanish elite sat in their waterlogged palaces, clutching their half-baked potato dignity, while the foundations of their city literally turned to mush. It was the ultimate irony. By trying to drain the lake, they had turned their city into a swamp. The response to this was, naturally, to double down. If the tunnel didn't work, they would dig an open trench. This became the Taja de Nachistango, a canyon carved by human hands that was so deep and so long it remains one of the largest earth-moving projects in history. For decades, the rhythm of the valley was the sound of iron hitting rock. The kingdom of the kids back in Spain might have been playing with their clockwork birds, but out here, the empire was bleeding its resources into a hole in the ground. They were trying to civilize the water by making it disappear. As the water receded over the centuries, the environmental cost became a slow-motion disaster. The Chinampas, those rhythmic masterpieces of irrigation, began to dry up. The willow trees died, the handflower trees withered, and the cool, humid microclimate of the valley was replaced by a harsh, dusty heat. The salt that the Aztecs had so carefully managed with dikes now rose to the surface of the dry lake bed, turning the land into a white, alkaline wasteland where nothing would grow. The Spanish had achieved their goal. They had dry land. But the land was dead. There's a tragic, rhythmic symmetry to the end of this story. The Spanish Habsburgs, obsessed with pure blood and still time, destroyed a living, breathing water system because they couldn't control its flow. They traded a sustainable paradise for a dusty, sinking city. Today, Mexico City continues to sink into the soft clay of the old lake bed, about 20 inches a year in some places. The lake is trying to come back, a slow, geological sigh that no amount of engineering can truly silence. The cathedrals are tilting, the pipes are snapping, and the water is still there, deep underground, waiting for the stone to finally give way. As we conclude our long walk through the mud and the gold, the clocks in the Escorial have finally stopped ticking. The half-baked potatoes are long gone, their chins and their empires crumbled into the footnotes of history. But if you sit very still in the center of Mexico City today, far beneath the noise of the traffic, you can almost imagine you hear it, the soft, rhythmic splash of a paddle in a canal that no longer exists. The water remembers, even if we don't. The valley is still a basin, the mountains are still watching, and the earth is still waiting for the rhythm to return. So, take one more deep breath. The story is over, the lights are low, and the world is quiet. It's time to let the water take you wherever it needs to go. Chapter 12. The Gilded Gout and the Sugar-Coated Decay. While the Spanish Habsburgs were busy eating clay and watching their jaws expand in the dry heat of Castile, a new kind of royal dysfunction was fermenting in the damp, lush greenery of France. We are shifting our focus to the Bourbons, the family that eventually stepped into the power vacuum left by the half-baked potatoes. If the Habsburgs were a story of bone and stone, the Bourbons were a story of sugar, silk, and a very specific, very painful medical condition, the gout. Because why settle for a genetic chin when you can have a toe so inflamed it brings an entire empire to a standstill? The French court, particularly under Louis XIV, the Sun King, was designed to be a gilded distraction. Louis understood that if you keep your nobles busy arguing over who gets to hold your shirt in the morning, they won't have time to start a civil war. He created Versailles, a palace built on a swamp, which seems to be a recurring theme in our journey. But unlike the Aztecs, who worked with the swamp, Louis tried to bully it into submission. He demanded fountains that sprayed water higher than the trees, even though the local water supply was woefully inadequate. This led to the Machine de Marly, a massive, rhythmic contraption of wood and iron that clanked and groaned 24 hours a day, trying to pump water uphill to feed the king's ego. But the real drama wasn't in the fountains, it was in the royal gut. The Bourbons were legendary eaters. They didn't just dine, they engaged in a culinary siege. Louis XIV was known to consume 4 plates of different soups, a whole pheasant, a partridge, a large bowl of salad, 2 thick slices of ham, mutton with garlic, and a plate of pastries, all in one sitting. And because he was the Sun King, everyone else had to watch him do it. It was a slow, rhythmic display of mastication that lasted for hours. Of course, he doubled down on the sugar, which was flowing in from the Caribbean colonies, turning his blood into a syrupy, acidic cocktail. The result was the gilded gout. Gout was known as the disease of kings, and the Bourbons wore it like a badge of gluttonous honor. Imagine a monarch who claims to be the center of the universe but has to be wheeled around his palace in a velvet-lined chair because his big toe feels like it's being poked with a red-hot needle. It was a rhythmic, throbbing pain that dictated the foreign policy of France. If the king's gout was acting up, the ambassadors were told to wait. If the king was having a good toe day, a war might be declared. The entire machinery of the state was calibrated to the inflammation of a single royal joint. The kingdom of the kids in France was just as precarious as in Spain, but with more lace. The royal children were raised on a diet of heavy creams and sugar-soaked fruits, ensuring that they, too, would eventually develop the family's signature limp. They were dressed in waistcoats so tight they could barely breathe, and wigs that were so tall they frequently caught fire on the chandeliers. It was a life of extreme, uncomfortable artifice. They were sad, sickly, and spoiled, moving through the hall of mirrors like little overdecorated ghosts, their internal organs slowly waving the white flag under the pressure of their lifestyle. The irony of Versailles was that for all its gold leaf and mirrors, it was notoriously filthy. Because the plumbing was mostly decorative, the courtiers would often relieve themselves behind the tapestries or in the corners of the grand staircases. The perfumed purgatory of Spain had nothing on the scented sewer of France. They used even more perfume, gallons of orange blossom water and lavender, to mask the fact that the most beautiful palace in the world smelled like a neglected stable. It was a world of high fashion and low hygiene, held together by a shared agreement to ignore the stench. As the sun sets on our final chapter, we see the Sun King sitting in his gardens, his foot propped up on a silk cushion, watching the fountain struggle to stay upright. The rhythm of the machine de Marly echoes in the distance, clank, hiss, thud, a mechanical heartbeat for a dying way of life. The sugar is sweet, the gout is sharp, and the empire is a beautiful, fragile shell. We have come a long way from the quiet mud of the Chinampas to the screaming toes of Versailles, but the lesson remains. Whether you are building a garden in a lake or a palace in a swamp, the earth always finds a way to remind you of your own fragility. Close your eyes now. The fountains are being turned off for the night. The silk curtains are being drawn. The half-baked potatoes and the gilded gouts have all faded into the dark. The only thing left is the slow, steady rhythm of your own breath, moving like the water in a long-forgotten canal. Sleep well. Chapter 13. The lead-lined lives of the Romanovs. We find ourselves now drifting away from the sugary, gout-ridden corridors of France and moving toward the vast, frozen silence of the East. We are entering the world of the Romanovs, a dynasty that ruled over a territory so large it spanned 11 time zones, yet whose internal lives were often as cramped and toxic as a sealed lead casket. If the Habsburgs were about inbreeding and the Bourbons were about overindulgence, the Romanovs were a story of extreme doubling down on the idea of autocracy, even as the world around them was literally catching fire. They were a family that lived in a gilded cage lined with poisonous beauty, governed by a rhythm of paranoia and cold, hard silver. The Romanovs had a particular obsession with the material world, specifically things that sparkled. They didn't just want wealth, they wanted a physical manifestation of divine right that was heavy enough to sink a ship. This brings us to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Like Versailles and Tenochtitlan, it was built on a swamp, because apparently the most dysfunctional empires are always drawn to soggy foundations. Peter the Great essentially willed the city into existence, forcing thousands of serfs to dump rocks into the Baltic mud until there was enough solid ground to support a palace. It was a rhythmic, brutal process of land versus water, and as usual, the water never truly surrendered. Inside these massive, drafty halls, the Romanovs surrounded themselves with the lead-lined aesthetics of the 19th century. This was an era where everything beautiful was also a little bit lethal. The emerald green wallpapers that the Tsars loved, they were often dyed with Scheele's green, an arsenic-based pigment that released toxic vapors into the stagnant palace air. The white makeup favored by the Tsarinas, lead-based, slowly seeping into the skin and causing the very pallor of royalty they so desired. They were living in a beautiful, slow-motion poisoning, their bodies absorbing the heavy metals of their status while they sat on thrones of solid malachite. The kingdom of the kids, in the Romanov line, reached its tragic peak with Alexei, the last Tsarevich. He was the ultimate precious stone, a boy whose life was dictated by a single, terrifying genetic quirk, hemophilia. Because his blood wouldn't clot, a simple bruise, a stumble in the garden, or a bump against a table could be a death sentence. He was the human equivalent of a Faberge egg, exquisitely made, infinitely expensive, and impossibly fragile. His parents, Nicholas and Alexandra, responded by turning the palace into a high-security nursery. Alexei was often carried everywhere by two massive sailors, his feet rarely touching the ground. He lived a life of forced stillness, watching other children play from behind the thick glass of the palace windows. This fragility led to the most famous doubling down in royal history, the introduction of Rasputin. When the best doctors in Russia, with all their leeches and silver-infused tonics, couldn't stop Alexei's bleeding, the empress turned to a Siberian mystic who smelled of goats and damp earth. There is a rhythmic irony here. The most sophisticated, lead-lined family in the world became entirely dependent on a man who didn't believe in bathing. Rasputin's presence in the palace was like a drop of ink in a glass of clear water. It slowly clouded everything, creating a perfumed purgatory of scandal and suspicion that the Romanovs were too isolated to see. The Romanovs also had a bizarre, rhythmic obsession with military parades. Even as the empire was crumbling, the Tsar spent hours every day reviewing troops. He loved the mechanical precision of the marching, the way thousands of men moved as one single, obedient machine. It was his version of the Habsburg clocks, a way to pretend that time and people could be controlled with a rhythmic stomp 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 on the pavement. But while the soldiers were marching in perfect lines in St. Petersburg, the rest of the country was starving. The Romanovs were so focused on the gilded pomp of the surface that they forgot the muddy reality of the foundations. As the final years of the dynasty approached, the family retreated further into their private world. They spent their days taking photographs, another new rhythmic obsession. They documented every picnic, every boat ride, and every tea service, capturing their own gilded decay in grainy black and white. They looked so calm in those photos, so half-baked potato oblivious. They didn't realize that the lead in their walls and the silver in their tea sets were nothing compared to the lead that was about to arrive in the form of a revolution. The story of the Romanovs ends not with a rhythmic tick of a clock, but with a sudden, violent silence in a basement in Ekaterinburg. The Faberge eggs were looted, the malachite columns were chipped, and the swamp began to reclaim the city. But tonight, we are back in the palace. The arsenic green curtains are drawn. The Tsarevich is sleeping, his breath steady and slow. The sailors are standing guard in the hall, their breathing synchronized with the ticking of a French clock. The world is cold, the ice is thick on the Neva, and for now, the empire is perfectly, precariously still. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of the heavy velvet blankets. Listen to the silence of the snow falling outside the window. The Romanovs have left the building, and only the rhythm of the winter remains. Chapter 14. The Arsenic Aesthetics and the Emerald Death Traps. We drift now across the North Sea, leaving the frozen malachite of Russia for the soot-stained, fog-drenched streets of Victorian London. If the Romanovs were poisoned by their own isolation, the Victorians were poisoned by their own sense of style. This was an era of extreme domesticity, where the home was treated as a secular temple, a place of safety and moral rectitude. But beneath the crocheted doilies and the heavy mahogany sideboards, the Victorian middle class was doubling down on a decor that was quite literally trying to kill them. We are entering the age of arsenic aesthetics, where the color of the season wasn't just green, it was a lethal, vibrant emerald that shimmered with the promise of a fashionable demise. The culprit was a pigment known as Sheely's green, followed by the even more brilliant Paris green. These were copper arsenite compounds that produced a hue so vivid it made the old vegetable dyes look like dishwater. Of course, the Victorians loved it. They used it for everything: wallpaper, artificial flowers, ball gowns, and even children's toys. They were living in a green purgatory. Imagine a middle-class family sitting down for tea in a room where the walls are sweating arsenic. As the damp London air interacted with the wallpaper paste, it encouraged the growth of molds that converted the arsenic into a colorless, odorless gas called trimethylarsine. The family would sit there, sipping their Darjeeling, slowly inhaling a toxic mist that made them feel melancholy and delicate, which they naturally assumed was just a sign of their refined, sensitive constitutions. The sad, sickly, and spoiled children of the Victorian era were the most vulnerable. They played on carpets dyed with arsenic and slept in nurseries where the very air was heavy with poison. When a child grew pale and lost their appetite, the physicians, those masters of the half-baked potato diagnosis, would prescribe a change of air or a tonic of iron and, occasionally, more arsenic, because it was believed to clear the complexion. It was a rhythmic cycle of illness. The more the child stayed inside to recover, the more they inhaled the toxic wallpaper that was making them sick in the first place. It was a closed loop of domestic tragedy, decorated with intricate floral patterns. Then there were the emerald ghosts of the ballroom. A single fashionable ball gown could contain as much as 900 grains of arsenic. As the lady danced, the friction of her movement would cause a fine green dust to shake loose, coating her skin and the lungs of her dance partners. It caused painful skin lesions and the vapors, but the aesthetic was simply too good to pass up. The irony was peak Victorian. They were a society obsessed with mourning and the beauty of death, and they were using their clothes to get there a little bit faster. They were walking, talking toxic waste sites, draped in silk and lace. But the arsenic wasn't the only ghost in the machine. We have to talk about the lead-lined larders. Victorian plumbing and food storage were a chaotic experiment in heavy metal poisoning. Water was delivered through lead pipes, and food was often adulterated with lead chromate to make it look fresher. They put alum in the bread to make it whiter, and copper salts in the pickles to keep them green. It was a rhythmic, daily consumption of the periodic table's most dangerous elements. The Victorian emotional meltdown, the fainting spells, the hysteria, the chronic fatigue, wasn't just a cultural trope. It was the sound of a population whose central nervous systems were being slowly dismantled by their own dinner plates. As the sun sets over the Thames, the fog rolls in to meet the coal smoke, creating a sooty purgatory that trapped the city in a gray, rhythmic embrace. Inside the houses, the gas lamps are lit. The gaslight made the arsenic-green walls glow with an eerie, hypnotic intensity. The family gathers around the piano, singing songs about lost loves and graveyard walks, while the wallpaper silently releases its invisible breath. It was a world of stagnant shadows, where the pursuit of the perfect home led to the construction of a gilded tomb. The Victorians eventually caught on, but it was a slow, stubborn realization. They didn't want to believe that beauty could be so cruel. They fought the doctors who tried to ban the green dyes, calling them alarmists and enemies of industry. But eventually, the half-baked potato pride gave way to the reality of the mounting body count. The green wallpapers were scraped off, the lead pipes were replaced, and the arsenic moved from the living room to the murder mystery novel, where it remains a star to this day. Close your eyes. Listen to the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. The gaslight is dimming, the emerald walls are fading into the dark, and the emerald ghosts have finished their final waltz. The Victorian night is long, and the air is finally, blessedly clear. Chapter 15. The Polished Curse of the Rising Sun. We leave the soot of London behind and float across the vast Pacific, arriving at the imperial palace of Meiji-era Japan. Here, the extreme doubling down took a form that was as white as snow and as rhythmic as a heartbeat: the obsession with polished white rice. For centuries, the Japanese elite, the emperors, the shoguns, and the samurai, had viewed the consumption of refined, pearly white rice as the ultimate status symbol. While the peasants were stuck eating ugly, brown rice, barley, and millet, the precious stones of the court ate only the most meticulously polished grains. It was a diet of gilded grains, and it led to a mysterious, slow-motion disaster known as caca, or what we now call beriberi. The irony was as sharp as a katana. The wealthier you were, the more likely you were to lose the ability to walk. The disease was so prevalent among the nobility that it was simply called the Edo sickness. It began with a rhythmic numbness in the legs, followed by a terrifying softening of the muscles, and eventually a total collapse of the heart. The imperial family was particularly devastated, because they were the half-baked potatoes of the East, kept in a state of perpetual ritual and forced stillness. They didn't realize that their refined diet was literally starving their nervous systems of vitamin B1. They were surrounded by gold, but their bodies were hollow. The kingdom of the kids, in the Japanese court, was a place of extreme, silent suffering. The young princes and princesses, raised on a diet of white rice and delicate sweets, were often described as fragile as glass. When a royal child developed the staggering gait of caca, the court physicians, who were still obsessed with the rhythm of the humors, would prescribe more herbal teas and, tragically, more white rice. It was a perfumed purgatory of misunderstanding. They believed the illness was caused by dampness or evil spirits, never suspecting that the very symbol of their purity was the source of their paralysis. As Japan opened to the West, the doubling down reached a fever pitch. The military, wanting to prove their strength, provided white rice to every soldier and sailor. It was meant to be a luxury, a way to show the world that Japan was no longer a peasant nation. But instead of creating a formidable force, they created an army of gilded ghosts. During the Russo-Japanese War, more soldiers died from the polished curse than from Russian bullets. They were literally dropping dead in their boots, their hearts giving out because they were too proud to eat the dirty husks of the grain. The struggle to solve the mystery of caca was a slow, bureaucratic slog. While a naval doctor named Takaki Kanehiro noticed that sailors who ate bread and meat didn't get sick, the army doctors, steeped in half-baked potato arrogance, refused to listen. They wanted a scientific germ to blame, not a lack of something as humble as a vitamin. They spent decades peering through microscopes, looking for a ghost, while their men continued to wither away. It was a world of stagnant pride, where the status of the grain was more important than the survival of the person eating it. Eventually, the rhythm of reality broke through. The gilded grains were supplemented with barley and beans, and the Edo sickness slowly receded into the history books. But for a time, the imperial palace was a place of polished stillness, where the most powerful people in the land sat on their silk cushions, unable to stand, watching the sun rise over an empire that was being crippled by its own refinement. Chapter 16: The Mercury Mirrors and the Shimmering Madness of Murano. We leave the polished rice of the East and float back toward Europe, settling into the damp, salt-crusted lagoons of Venice. If the Aztecs built a city on a lake for survival, the Venetians built one for vanity and trade. And at the heart of that vanity was glass. Specifically, the mirrors of Murano. We are entering the world of the Mercury mirrors, where the pursuit of a perfect reflection led to a very specific, shimmering kind of madness. Because when you're a Venetian glassmaker, why settle for a dull piece of polished metal when you can double down and use a toxic slurry of tin and mercury to show the world its own face? For centuries, the secrets of mirror making were guarded more fiercely than any royal bloodline. The glassmakers were sequestered on the island of Murano, ostensibly to prevent fires in the main city, but really to keep their gilded secrets from leaking to the rest of the world. Leaving the island without permission was a crime punishable by death. It was a rhythmic, secluded life. The men spent their days in front of blistering furnaces, breathing in the fumes of stagnant heat. To create a mirror, they had to apply a thin layer of tin foil to the back of the glass and then pour liquid mercury over it. They would then spend hours smoothing and flattening the mercury with heavy stones, their bare hands often dipping into the silver liquid as if it were harmless water. The result was the mercury tremor. Mercury is a neurotoxin that doesn't just kill you, it unspools you. It starts with a rhythmic shaking of the hands, a glassmaker's twitch, followed by irritability, memory loss, and a strange, paranoid anxiety known as erethism. This is where we get the term mad as a hatter, but it applied just as well to the mirror makers of Venice. These men were creating the most beautiful objects in the world, yet they were becoming shimmering ghosts in the process. Their teeth would loosen, their hair would thin, and they would develop a half-baked potato confusion that made them walk through the narrow streets of Murano talking to people who weren't there. The irony was reflected in the mirrors themselves. The wealthy elites of Europe, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, and the Romanovs, saved for years to buy a Venetian mirror. They wanted to see themselves in the clearest possible light. But as they gazed into their reflections, they were looking through a film of poison that had cost a man his mind. The mirror was a gilded trap. It reflected the sad, sickly, and spoiled faces of the aristocracy, their lead-based makeup and their arsenic-dyed clothes, all framed by the toxic labor of a Venetian artisan. It was a hall of mirrors where every reflection was a lie and every surface was a danger. The French, of course, couldn't stand the Venetian monopoly. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was so obsessed with mirrors that he had his ministers bribe several Murano glassmakers to defect to France. It was a reflective espionage. The Venetians responded by sending assassins to poison the defectors, proving that in the world of luxury, the extreme doubling down often involves actual daggers. Eventually, the French succeeded in building the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, creating a space of infinite vanity where the king could see his gilded gout from every possible angle. It was the ultimate display of power, 357 mirrors, each one a testament to the fact that the Sun King had finally conquered the secret of the lagoon. As the industry grew, the mercury madness became a background noise of the European elite. The mirrors grew larger, the frames more ornate, and the glass clearer, even as the men who made them grew shorter-lived. It was a world of stagnant beauty, where the clarity of the image was more important than the health of the creator. The Venetians sat on their sinking islands, surrounded by their shimmering secrets, while the rest of the world looked into the glass and tried to ignore the tremors in their own hands. Chapter 17. The Sugar-Coated Spines and the Black-Toothed Majesty. We drift now away from the toxic, shimmering lagoons of Venice and travel back in time, landing in the drafty, tapestry-lined halls of Tudor England. Here, we find a different kind of extreme doubling down, centered not on mercury or lead, but on a substance that was once so rare it was kept in silver boxes under lock and key: sugar. We are entering the world of the sugar-coated spines, where the arrival of the Great Caribbean trade turned the English elite into a generation of sweetened ghosts. Specifically, we have to talk about the dental health of Queen Elizabeth I, a woman who was the precious stone of her age, yet whose smile was a stagnant disaster of colonial luxury. In the late 1500s, sugar was the ultimate status symbol. It wasn't just a sweetener, it was a medium for art. The Tudors loved subtleties, elaborate sculptures made of sugar paste, depicting hunts, castles, and even biblical scenes, all of which were meant to be eaten. Elizabeth I was notoriously fond of these gilded sweets. She added sugar to her wine, her meat, and her medicine. It was a rhythmic, daily consumption of pure glucose. Because the half-baked potatoes of the English court didn't yet understand the concept of a toothbrush, the result was a systemic rotting of the royal mouth. By the time she reached her 60s, the Queen's teeth were described by foreign ambassadors as being very black, a color they noted with a mixture of horror and diplomatic politeness. The irony here is truly Tudor. Because the Queen had black teeth, the rest of the court decided to double down on the look. Black teeth became a fashion statement. It was a visual proof that you were wealthy enough to afford the sugar that caused decay. Noble women who were unfortunate enough to have healthy, white teeth would actually use soot or charcoal to blacken them, trying to mimic the rotting majesty of their sovereign. It was a world of stagnant vanity, where the sign of a decaying body was worn as a badge of high-born success. They were sad, sickly, and spoiled, smiling through the pain of abscesses because to look healthy was to look poor. The kingdom of the kids, in the Tudor era, was particularly susceptible to this. The royal children were given sugar sops, bread soaked in sweetened ale, from a very young age. This created a generation of fragile aristocrats who suffered from constant toothaches and the rheum. The physicians, who were still obsessed with the rhythm of the humors, believed that toothaches were caused by little worms burrowing into the gums. Their solution? To blow smoke into the patient's mouth or to apply caustic chemicals that often did more damage than the rot itself. It was a perfumed purgatory of dental agony, masked by the scent of rosewater and the constant fluttering of fans. Elizabeth herself suffered so greatly from her sugar-coated spines that she often had to stuff her cheeks with fine cloths when she went out in public, just to give her face a fuller, more youthful appearance. It was a rhythmic, daily ritual of concealment. She was the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana who had defeated the Spanish Armada, yet she was being defeated by a simple carbohydrate. She lived in a state of gilded paranoia, fearing the moment her subjects would see the reality behind the white lead makeup and the stuffed cheeks. As the Queen aged, the pain made her increasingly delicate and temperamental. The court moved in a hushed, rhythmic silence, trying not to provoke a royal meltdown triggered by a throbbing molar. The empire was expanding, the Renaissance was blooming, and Shakespeare was writing his masterpieces, but the center of it all was a woman who couldn't chew a piece of roasted venison without winced agony. It was the stagnant reality of the Tudor peak, a global power led by a woman whose mouth was a graveyard of colonial spoils. Chapter 18. The Velvet Nightmares and the Fur-Lined Hermits. We leave the rotting, sugar-sweetened air of the Tudor court and travel back toward the bitter, biting winds of the Russian north. But we are moving away from the lead-painted palaces of St. Petersburg and heading into the older, darker heart of the Kremlin in Moscow. Here, we find the velvet nightmares of the early Romanovs and the Ruriks, the Tsars who lived in a state of extreme isolation, wrapped in layers of sable and ermine so thick they could barely move. This was a world of forced stillness, where the monarch was treated less like a human and more like a holy icon that might shatter if exposed to a breeze or a commoner's gaze. The palace was a labyrinth of stagnant shadows. The Tarim Palace, where the royal family lived, was designed with low ceilings and narrow corridors, specifically to keep the heat in and the world out. The rooms were draped in heavy, dark velvets and lined with the finest furs from the Siberian frontier. It was a rhythmic, claustrophobic existence. A Tsar might spend his entire day moving from one small, incense-filled room to another, his body encased in gilded heaviness. Their robes, known as platno, were so stiff with gold embroidery and pearls that they could weigh up to 60 pounds. It was a literal burden of office, a half-baked potato strategy of power that prioritized the appearance of stability over the ability to actually walk. The kingdom of the kids, in these fur-lined halls, was particularly tragic. The royal women and children lived in the Tarim, a secluded section of the palace where they were hidden away from all male eyes except for those of their closest relatives and the clergy. It was a perfumed purgatory of embroidery and prayer. The princesses were the hidden jewels of the empire, yet they lived like gilded hermits. They were never allowed to marry below their station, but because the Tsars considered almost everyone to be below their station, many of these women simply grew old in the shadows, their lives measured by the rhythmic ticking of a clock and the slow progress of a needle through silk. The health of these velvet nightmares was, predictably, a disaster, because they were never allowed to leave the stuffy, smoke-filled rooms of the palace. They suffered from a chronic lack of sunlight and fresh air. They were sad, sickly, and spoiled in the most literal sense. They developed the scurvy and the vapors, their skin turning a translucent, sickly blue that was, ironically, considered a sign of high birth. The physicians, who were often foreigners kept in a state of gilded captivity, would prescribe unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, or ground-up emeralds to cure the royal melancholy. It was a world of stagnant medicine, where the cure was often more expensive and more useless than the disease itself. The doubling down reached its peak with the ritual of the Tsar's progress. When the Tsar did occasionally leave the palace, he traveled in a closed carriage, surrounded by curtains of heavy velvet. The common people were ordered to turn their backs or look at the ground as he passed. To look upon the Tsar was to risk being struck blind by his gilded majesty. It was a rhythmic, silent procession through a city of mud and wood. The Tsar sat in his dark, fur-lined box, a hermit of the steppes, entirely disconnected from the reality of the people he ruled. He was a god in a velvet nightmare, a man who owned everything but saw nothing. Then there was the Feast of the Boars. The Russian court was legendary for its hospitality, but it was a rhythmic, exhausting kind of fun. The meals lasted for 10 or 12 hours, with hundreds of dishes being served in a specific, unchanging order. But because the Tsar was a holy icon, he often didn't eat at all in public. He would sit at the head of the table, wrapped in his 60 pounds of gold, watching his nobles drink themselves into a stupor. It was a display of static power. He was the still point in a turning, drunken world, a gilded anchor that kept the empire from drifting away into the snow. As the night deepens over the frozen Moskva River, the heavy iron doors of the Tarim are locked from the inside. The incense smoke clings to the velvet walls, and the Tsar is finally unburdened of his golden robes. He sits in his small, warm room, wrapped in a simple robe of sable, listening to the rhythmic chanting of the monks in the nearby chapel. The velvet nightmares are tucked away for another day. The world outside is a vast, white silence, and inside, the gilded hermits are finally, safely alone. Chapter 19. The Porcelain Heartbeats and the Forbidden Stagnation. We leave the heavy, fur-lined gloom of Moscow and float across the vast, windswept steppes of Asia, descending into the heart of the Forbidden City in Beijing. Here, the extreme doubling down on royal protocol reached its final, most delicate conclusion. We are entering the world of the late Qing dynasty, a place of porcelain heartbeats, where the emperor was not just a man, but the son of heaven, a being so central to the cosmic order that his every movement was a rhythmic calculation. If the Romanovs were about lead and the Tudors were about sugar, The Qin were about the stagnant perfection of a world that refused to acknowledge that the clock had already struck midnight. The Forbidden City was a masterpiece of gilded isolation. It was a city within a city, surrounded by high walls and filled with thousands of eunuchs, officials, and concubines whose entire existence was dedicated to the maintenance of the emperor's stillness. The emperor lived a life of forced rhythms. Every morning, he was woken at a specific second, dressed in robes of imperial yellow that were so intricate they required a small army to assemble, and fed meals that consisted of over 100 dishes, most of which he never touched. It was a display of empty abundance. The food was cooked to show that the empire could provide it, not because the emperor needed to eat it. It was a rhythmic, daily waste of thousands of pounds of pork, duck, and shark fin, all cold by the time it reached the table. The kingdom of the kids, in the Qin court, was perhaps the most tragic of all. We have to look at the final emperor, Puyi, who was placed on the throne at the age of 2. Imagine being a toddler in a world where you are the only person allowed to sit while grown men, your elders and teachers, must kowtow until their foreheads hit the stone floor. Puyi was a porcelain prince, raised in a vacuum of reality. He wasn't allowed to play with other children, so his only friends were the aging eunuchs who whispered gilded lies into his ears. He was sad, sickly, and spoiled in a very specific way. He had the power of life and death over everyone he saw, yet he wasn't allowed to step outside the palace gates to see what a tree looked like in the real world. The health of the Qing elite was governed by the rhythm of the pulses. Traditional Chinese medicine in the palace was an incredibly complex, slow-motion art form. Because the emperor's body was sacred, the physicians weren't allowed to actually touch him. Instead, they would tie a silk thread to his wrist and feel the pulse from behind a curtain in the next room. It was stagnant science at its peak. They would prescribe dragon bone, fossilized remains, or pearl powder to balance the royal qi, while the emperor was actually suffering from the very modern, very human stresses of an empire that was falling apart around him. The irony of the porcelain heartbeats was the obsession with the past. While the rest of the world was building steamships and telegraph lines, the Qing court was doubling down on the 9-step protocol for pouring tea. They spent millions on gilded trivia, like the precise shade of blue for a ceramic vase or the exact length of a concubine's fingernail protectors. These protectors, often made of gold and jade, were symbols of ultimate leisure. They proved that the wearer had never performed a single second of manual labor in her life. She couldn't even pick up a spoon. She was a gilded statue, a prisoner of her own status, moving with a slow, rhythmic grace through a world that was effectively a museum. As the dynasty reached its end, the stagnant shadows grew longer. The Empress Dowager Cixi, the real power behind the throne, spent the empire's naval budget on a marble boat that couldn't float, a permanent, rhythmic mockery of progress. She preferred the stillness of the lake to the movement of the sea. The Forbidden City became a perfumed purgatory of incense and old silk, where everyone was pretending it was still 1700 while the 20th century was banging on the gates. Chapter 20: The Iron-Lined Melancholy of the Gilded Smog. We float now away from the yellow tiles of Beijing and across the churning Atlantic, arriving in the soot-heavy air of New York and Newport at the turn of the 20th century. Here, we encounter a new breed of royalty, the industrial tycoons. They weren't born with the Habsburg jaw or the Tudor tooth, but they were determined to double down on the aesthetic of decay anyway. This was the Gilded Age, a period of extreme acquisition, where men who made their fortunes in the rhythmic clatter of steel mills and the oily grime of railroads tried to buy the history they didn't have. They built cottages that were actually 70-room marble palaces, creating a world of iron-lined melancholy, where the American dream was wrapped in the moth-eaten velvet of old Europe. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Carnegies were the new precious stones. They didn't have ancestors who fought at Agincourt, so they simply bought the stone fireplaces from the chateaus where those ancestors lived and shipped them across the ocean. It was a rhythmic, expensive game of gilded Tetris. They lived in a state of synthetic stagnation, populating their mansions with half-baked potato portraits of other people's families, just to give the walls a sense of gravity. But beneath the French tapestries and the English paneling, the air was thick with the industrial purgatory of the cities they had built. The windows of their Fifth Avenue mansions were kept perpetually sealed against the soot, creating an interior world of stagnant luxury, where the only thing that moved was the silent, white-gloved service of 1,000 servants. The kingdom of the kids, in this era, was a place of polished loneliness. The children of the Gilded Age, the poor little rich girls, and the fragile heirs, were raised in nurseries that looked like miniature throne rooms. They were sad, sickly, and spoiled by a surplus of everything except their parents' time. Their lives were governed by the rhythm of the governess, a strict schedule of French lessons, piano practice, and forced deportment. They were dressed in stiff lace and velvet collars that made them look like tiny, miserable versions of the Habsburgs. They weren't allowed to play in the dirt because dirt was for the people who worked in their father's mines. They were iron-lined puppets, curated for a high society debut that was more of a business merger than a coming-out party. The health of these industrial elites was plagued by the gout of the nouveau riche. Because they wanted to out-bourbon the Bourbons, their dinners were marathons of excessive mastication. A standard banquet could last 5 hours and consist of 14 courses, each paired with a different vintage of wine. They ate gilded toxins, rich sauces thickened with heavy cream, game birds stuffed with truffles, and sugar sculptures that would have made Elizabeth I weep with envy. The result was a generation of men with stagnant livers and heavy hearts, suffering from the disease of the dollar. They built massive gymnasiums in their basements that they never used, preferring to sit in their leather-bound libraries, nursing their inflamed toes and wondering why all their money couldn't buy a rhythmic night's sleep. The irony of the Gilded Age was the Biltmore illusion. They built the largest houses in American history, yet they often felt like gilded refugees inside them. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore in the mountains of North Carolina, a French Renaissance chateau with 250 rooms, and then found himself wandering the halls in a state of quiet melancholy, unable to fill the silence. The rhythmic click-clack of his leather shoes on the marble floors was the only heartbeat the house had. They had created a mechanical aristocracy, where the electricity was new and the elevators were polished, but the soul was a stagnant pond. As the sun sets over the Newport cliffs, the cottages begin to glow with the harsh, artificial light of the new century. The industrial tycoons sit on their terraces, looking out at the Atlantic, perhaps dreaming of the scented purgatory of Versailles or the muddy wisdom of the Aztecs. But the smog of the city is never far away, a gray, rhythmic reminder of where the gold came from. The Gilded Age is a velvet nightmare of its own making, a world where everyone is dressed for a ball that has already ended, and the only thing left to acquire is the silence of the dark. Chapter 21: The Lead-Lined Libraries and the Ink-Stained Recluses. We drift away from the marble terraces of Newport and descend into the hushed, subterranean quiet of the lead-lined libraries. We are moving into the world of the obsessive book collectors, the men and women who treated paper and vellum with more reverence than their own half-baked potato relatives. If the industrial tycoons wanted to buy history, these bibliophiles wanted to inhale it. They lived in a state of ink-stained isolation, surrounding themselves with towering stacks of leather-bound volumes that acted as a literal acoustic shield against the noisy, rhythmic progress of the 20th century. Because why engage with the living when you can double down on the company of the dead, bound in goat skin and stamped with gold leaf? The libraries of these eccentrics were masterpieces of stagnant atmosphere. Imagine a room where the air hasn't been changed since the mid-19th century, a thick, perfumed purgatory of vanilla-scented decaying paper, old glue, and the faint, metallic tang of lead-based inks. The collectors, like the sad, sickly, and spoiled royals we've met before, often suffered from library lung, a rhythmic cough caused by inhaling the dust of 1,000 centuries. They moved through their narrow aisles with a hunched melancholy, their fingers stained black by the soot of oil lamps and the oxidation of ancient bindings. They weren't just reading, they were consuming the past, one moldy page at a time. There was a particular, extreme doubling down when it came to the materials. The true, gilded recluses sought out books bound in human skin, a macabre practice known as anthropodermic bibliopagy. They believed that certain texts, perhaps a treatise on anatomy or a book of dark poetry, required a living binding. It was the ultimate stagnant obsession. They would sit in their lead-lined rooms, stroking the smooth, tan surface of a book that was once a person, feeling a rhythmic connection to the macabre history of the world. It was a velvet nightmare of the intellect, a way to turn the human body into a permanent piece of furniture. The kingdom of the kids, in these households, was a place of silent exclusion. The children of the great collectors were often forbidden from entering the library for fear their rhythmic energy or sticky fingers might damage a first edition. They grew up in the shadow of the books, hearing the gilded whispers of their parents talking to the shelves. These children were fragile appendages to a collection, raised by tutors who valued the rhythm of the Latin verb more than the joy of a game of tag. They became academic ghosts, drifting through hallways lined with crates of new acquisitions, waiting for a parent who was too busy cataloging the gout of the Greeks to notice the melancholy of the nursery. The health of the bibliophile was governed by sedentary decay. Because they spent 14 hours a day sitting in high-backed chairs, their blood became stagnant and thick. They developed the scholar stoop and a pale, ink-washed complexion that made them look like the parchment they worshipped. They lived on a diet of library rations, cold tea and dry biscuits, because they didn't want to risk a grease stain on a Gutenberg Bible. They were gilded martyrs to the printed word, sacrificing their eyesight and their posture for the rhythmic satisfaction of a complete set of disastrous dynastic histories. The irony of the lead-lined library was that the more books the collector acquired, the less they actually knew about the world outside. They were refugees of the page, living in a chronological purgatory. A collector might spend 20 years hunting for a specific pamphlet on the irrigation of Aztec gardens, only to find it and realize they no longer had the strength to turn the pages. They had built a gilded prison of knowledge, where every book was a bar and every shelf was a wall. They were mechanical readers, their minds ticking along with the rhythm of the footnotes, while the real history of the world was happening outside their shuttered windows. As the candle flickers out in the library, the ink-stained recluse finally closes the heavy volume. The acoustic shield of the books holds the silence of the night. The smell of old leather and dust lingers in the air like a stagnant memory. The world of the 20th century is far away, muffled by the weight of a million words. The collector is asleep in his chair, dreaming of lost libraries and half-baked potato poets. The night is deep, the ink is dry, and the lead-lined library is finally, blessedly, still. Chapter 22, The Satin-Lined Sanatoriums and the Rest Cure of the Bored. We emerge from the dusty, leaden silence of the libraries and drift toward the crisp, thin air of the Swiss Alps and the manicured lawns of the restorative retreats. We are entering the world of the satin-lined sanatoriums, the final destination for the gilded elites who had been poisoned by their own luxury. By the early 1900s, the half-baked potato anatomy of the upper classes had finally buckled under the weight of too much chocolate, too much arsenic, and too much stagnant expectation. The solution wasn't to change their lives, but to double down on a new, rhythmic form of scientific stillness known as the rest cure. The sanatorium was a masterpiece of clinical elegance. It was a place where melancholy was treated like a high-end fashion accessory. The wealthy would check in for months at a time, trading their velvet robes for scientific pajamas made of the finest silk. The rhythm of the day was governed by the clockwork of recovery. At 10 a.m., the gilded invalids were wheeled out onto massive balconies to engage in passive sunbathing. They would lie perfectly still for hours, wrapped in wool blankets, staring at the mountains in a state of synthetic zen. They were fragile objects being aired out like expensive tapestries, hoping the mountain air would blow away the industrial smog of their souls. The kingdom of the kids in these retreats was a hauntingly quiet place. Children who were deemed too high-strung or delicate were sent to these satin-lined prisons to be standardized. They weren't allowed to run, shout, or read anything stimulating. Their lives were reduced to a rhythm of milk and nap time. They were sad, sickly, and spoiled miniatures, living in a world of white-tiled walls and hushed voices. They grew up believing that health was a state of perfect inertia, and that the outside world was a dangerous germ box waiting to infect them. They were the heirs of the void, waiting for a vitality that had been drained away by generations of forced stillness. The extreme doubling down of the sanatorium was found in the diet. To combat nervous exhaustion, the physicians, those direct descendants of the half-baked potato doctors, prescribed hypernutrition. This involved forcing the patients to consume massive quantities of cream, butter, and raw eggs. A patient might be required to drink 4 quarts of milk a day while lying motionless. It was a rhythmic stuffing, a way to turn the human body into a stagnant reservoir of calories. The goal was to put on healthy flesh, but it often just resulted in a group of very bored, very bloated aristocrats staring at the snow with cream-induced lethargy. The irony of the satin-lined sanatorium was that it became a social hub. While the patients were ostensibly there to escape the world, they spent all their time gossiping about who had the most fashionable nervous breakdown. It was a perfumed purgatory of status. If you weren't delicate enough to require a 6-month stay in Davos, you simply weren't anyone. They turned their gilded decay into a competition, comparing their pulse rhythms and their mineral water regimens as if they were racing yachts. They were inert athletes, competing to see who could do the least for the longest amount of time. As the sun dips behind the Eiger, the gilded invalids are wheeled back into their heated rooms. The rhythm of the sanatorium shifts to the evening, a light broth, a sedative, and the mechanical humming of an early electrical healing machine vibrating against a silk-covered limb. The world of the 20th century is speeding up, but here, inside the satin-lined sanatorium, time is a stagnant pool. The patients are asleep in their white beds, dreaming of pure air and golden slumber, while the mountains stand watch in a cold, eternal silence. Close your eyes now. Feel the crispness of the air and the weight of the silk blankets. The mountains are blue, the snow is soft, and the rhythm of rest has taken hold. The world is far away, the milk is cold, and the satin-lined sanatorium is finally, blessedly, still. Sleep well, for the cure is working, the clock is ticking, and the silence of the Alps is the only medicine left. Chapter 23: The Chromium Cocktails and the Neon-Lined Nightmares. We descend from the silent, milky heights of the Alps and plummet into the rhythmic chaos of the 1920s. We have entered the world of the chromium cocktails, where the gilded decay of the past was polished with a new, industrial sheen. This was the age of the Art Deco elite, a generation that had seen the velvet nightmares of the old empire's collapse and decided to double down on a future made of steel, glass, and high-velocity jazz. They traded their satin-lined sanatoriums for geometric speakeasies, trying to outrun their half-baked potato heritage with the help of a shaker full of gin and a stagnant cloud of cigarette smoke. The aesthetic was one of extreme aerodynamics. Everything, from the skyscrapers to the cigarette cases, was designed to look like it was moving at 100 miles an hour, even when it was sitting perfectly still. The elites lived in neon-lined purgatories, penthouses with black marble floors and chromium furniture that felt as cold and hard as a machine gun. It was a synthetic vitality. They were trying to mask the industrial melancholy of the post-war world with a rhythmic, frantic energy. They didn't want the stillness of the lake or the rest of the mountain. They wanted the jitter of the city. The kingdom of the kids, in this era, was a place of chrome isolation. The children of the bright young things were raised by Swedish nurses in nurseries that looked like laboratory clean rooms. They were standardized miners, given scientific toys made of primary-colored wood and steel. They were sad, sickly, and spoiled in a new, modern way, left alone in their streamlined cradles, while their parents were out dancing the Charleston until dawn. They were the first generation to be raised on synthetic rhythms, their lives measured by the ticking of a Bauhaus clock and the hum of a vacuum cleaner. The health of the Art Deco elite was governed by the gilded toxins of the Jazz Age. They abandoned the heavy creams of the sanatorium for the liquid diet of the cocktail hour. The chromium cocktail wasn't just a drink, it was a medicinal requirement. They suffered from gin-soaked nerves and metropolitan insomnia, their bodies vibrating with the rhythm of the subways. To combat the neon-lined nightmares of their own anxiety, they turned to the new, gilded pills, early barbiturates and amphetamines that allowed them to be manically awake all night and chemically asleep all day. It was a mechanical cycle of highs and lows, a stagnant carousel that never stopped spinning. The irony of the Art Deco era was the mirror of the machine. They worshipped the machine for its efficiency, yet they used that efficiency to become more beautifully useless than ever. They wore lead-lined tuxedos and sequined armor, their clothes designed to reflect the harsh, electric lights of the ballroom. They were shimmering ghosts in a world of hard edges. They had all the gilded speed of a locomotive, but they were headed nowhere. They were artistic refugees, hiding from the reality of the Great Depression in a geometric dream of gold leaf and black lacquer. As the jazz band plays its final, frantic note, the neon-lined nightmares begin to fade into the gray light of morning. The chromium cocktails are empty, the geometric speakeasies are silent, and the bright young things are finally, exhaustedly, still. The world of the 1920s is a stagnant memory, a flash of silver in a dark room. The skyscrapers stand like gilded tombstones over a city that has finally run out of breath. Chapter 24. The Atomic Aesthetics and the Plastic Purgatories. We step out of the smoke-filled speakeasy and into the blinding, suburban sun of the 1950s. The world has traded the chromium cocktail for the atomic martini, and the gilded decay has been shrink-wrapped in cellophane. We are entering the age of the plastic purgatories, where the global elite, now a mix of corporate titans and Technicolor royalty, decided to double down on a future that was better living through chemistry. They wanted a world that was perfectly washable, entirely synthetic, and stagnantly safe from the looming shadow of the mushroom cloud. The aesthetic was one of geometric optimism. Everything was shaped like a kidney bean, a satellite, or a chemical bond. The elites lived in glass-walled aquariums, houses that were designed to blur the line between the industrial indoors and the manicured outdoors. But despite the transparency, the air inside was a stagnant cocktail of cigarette smoke and the aromatic off-gassing of new polymers. They surrounded themselves with miracle materials, formica, naugahyde, and Tupperware, believing that if they could just make their environment wipe clean, they could erase the half-baked potato messiness of human history. The kingdom of the kids in this era was a polychrome playground. The children of the atomic age were the first to be raised in a world of standardized fun. They were given plastic life simulators, dolls that drank and wet, and chemistry sets that contained actual radioactive isotopes. They were sad, sickly, and spoiled by a surplus of gilded sugar in the form of neon-colored cereals and hydrogenated snacks. They lived in a rhythm of the television, their imaginations calibrated to the stagnant glow of the cathode ray tube. They were the nylon heirs, growing up in a world where nature was something you watched through a picture window while sitting on a stain-resistant sofa. The health of the mid-century elite was governed by the gilded pharmacy. This was the peak of the Milltown melancholy. To cope with the atomic anxiety of the Cold War, the elites turned to Mother's Little Helpers, a rhythmic consumption of tranquilizers and pep pills. They were chemically calibrated, living in a state of synthetic serenity that masked the stagnant fear of total annihilation. Their bodies were plastic vessels, preserved by a diet of frozen convenience and vitamin-fortified space food. They were trying to achieve a state of biological inertia, hoping that if they stayed perfectly still and perfectly medicated, the world would stop changing. The irony of the atomic aesthetic was the fallout shelter. The same elites who spent their days in glass-walled aquariums spent their nights dreaming of lead-lined basements. They built gilded bunkers stocked with canned peaches and board games, creating a subterranean purgatory where they could wait out the end of the world in synthesized comfort. It was the ultimate extreme doubling down. They had created a world so advanced that their only hope for survival was to crawl back into a hole in the ground, like a high-tech caveman.